we will conduct this interview in two parts. Okay. One will deal with your early life and your struggles to become established in a foreign country, foreign region. Yeah. And the second part when you achieved success as an artist and what your plans are for Goa and for the future. So, can you tell me a little bit about your very early years in Bombay? What happened there?
Very early years. I was born in Bombay, but my family had very strong links with Goa. And my mother played the piano and sang beautifully, and my father also sang. He played the guitar. So we had a lot of music. I think like all Goan families, a lot of music in the house. And we were very lucky that in Santa Cruz, where I grew up, the parish of Santa Cruz West, there was it was called Scadams, and in fact there were several families that got together and started this competitive music and drama festival. And every child from the age of 7 was allowed to get up on stage, sing. There was a classical song category, there was jazz, there was piano, violin. So you just had to register and you could take part. There were age groups as well, so it was quite fair. And then they had children's choir, adult choir, children's play, and an adult play as well. So it covered a wide spectrum of the performing arts. And so every year my brothers and I would take part in this competition. It was a very fierce competition because somehow in Santa Cruz they were mostly Goans. They were all very musical.
There was someone called Fairly Martin there.
Yes.
To sing Gilbert and Sullivan.
Absolutely, and my parents sang in those Gilbert and Sullivan operas. They used to do it to raise money for the church and the school, the local school. And I remember as a little child, my mother practicing for these shows, and she wouldn't talk to us because she had to save her voice. You know, it was very funny because I do the same with my kids. At least I did. I mean, the standard of singing was unbelievable. When I think back, there was one lady who was a natural coloratura, which is a very high soprano. And she told me that her father didn't want her to study music. He refused to let her go abroad to study because he didn't want her to be a singer. So she sang in these...
Actually, I think he didn't want her to marry a foreigner.
No. It's not necessarily something that has to happen. But anyway, there was also a gentleman who was a natural bass, Colonel Almeida. He went and lived in Australia eventually, but I remember being impressed by these voices. My parents sang, my aunt, one aunt was a mezzo, another one was a soprano. So I suppose I was very lucky that my mother agreed to send me abroad. I mean, I did a degree in English and French at Sophia College in Bombay, and then I was allowed to go abroad to study. And I was lucky that I was introduced by an Englishman who came to India to a teacher at the Guildhall School. I'd never heard of the Guildhall School of Music, but it's very important to go to a good teacher. And so I immediately applied to that school, and he convinced the principal to let me in with no test or anything, because I think I would have failed. And he said in 6 months he would have me up to scratch.
How old were you at the time?
How could you ask a lady her age?
I'm not asking you about your age, I'm asking you about the past. From which we
I'm sure there are a few mathematicians in the room who will make quick calculations. I gave you a clue. I went to university here in Bombay. I was in my late teens. Yeah. Okay.
Because in those days one went to university very early.
Far too young, absolutely. Anyway, so I went to London, and I knew from the start that I had a lot of catching up to do. Fortunately, I'd studied French at quite a high level. I'd studied English literature, so I was connected with poetry and literature, and you need that. That's not a very important aspect of singing, is appreciating poetry and also imagery. If you're singing in an opera, you've got to have a dramatic flair. But mostly, I sing a lot of lieder, French song, English song, and you're dealing with the great poets of every century.
And the words have very special meanings.
Absolutely, absolutely. But I had to study Italian, German, And I tried singing. I have sung a lot in Spanish, but sadly I've never really mastered the language, whereas I feel I have a good grasp of Italian, German and French. My French I had to work on to improve the pronunciation.
Fortunately, Patricia, there aren't too many operas in Sanskrit.
That's true, that's true. I'm sure it's a good language to sing in, don't you?
Oh yes, it would be.
Yeah.
With a limited audience, but good.
Oh, I'm not sure. We're talking about the possibility of doing opera here in India, and I'm constantly thinking, for example, Carmen could be made into an Indian setting, a beedi factory where they're rolling beedis, and the women are working while the scene is enacted. The magic flute, I think, would be perfect in an Indian setting because you've got, there's a wedding. It's not really a wedding scene, but it's like our Indian ceremony. The test of water and the test of fire that the two young people have to go through. And you've got the queen of the night. I always say Raat Ki Rani, but actually that means something else. Raat Ki Rani is a flower, and she's anything but a flower. So she's more like Kali or someone really, one of the powerful female goddesses. But I think it would work really well in India. So.
Now, when you went to the Guildhall School of Music, I don't think you got a culture shock because Bombay is fairly cosmopolitan.
Yeah.
How about a shock as far as the discipline that was required of you in terms of study and singing?
Not really. The shock was the cold weather and the winter when I didn't see the sun for several months and I really felt I was going to die. Every winter I thought it was so cold because I had to stand on Fleet Street to get a bus to go back to my convent hostel, and they closed at 9, so I used to be racing to get back home. That was the difficulty, but I was used to hard work. I mean, I think our Indian children, we work very hard at school, whereas in England they always talk about don't stress the children, don't give them more work than they can deal with. So I was happy. In a way, the students in my class were 2 or 3 years younger than me. They'd just come out of school. They were ready for a good time. But I was there because I wanted to learn, and I knew I had 3 years to make the most of it, because my dad said, okay, 3 years, but then you must come home and settle down. Yeah, so, I loved learning music, the songs. My singing teacher allowed me, he was German, and he allowed me to sit in on the German song classes, the senior classes, because I just needed to listen to as much music as possible. I only had the first volume of Schubert here.
And now you have sung a lot of Schubert, and I've got some Schubert albums out.
I do, yes, that's right. I've got a Richard Strauss album coming out, I hope next year. It's been recorded and edited. But for me, it was a delight to explore this repertoire, to work on the voice. But actually, in looking back now, I realized that you actually study. Once you start performing, you're still studying, you're still developing, your voice adjusts to new repertoire. And I actually worked with a teacher for many years while I was performing, not to have lessons every week, but whenever I had a new piece, I would always go to the teacher to make sure that what I was doing was good and yeah.
So this was like a coach, a personal...
No, not a coach actually, because I worked with coaches as well. My first teacher was a very musical teacher, and that he taught me the different styles of interpretation, and he taught me to sing very musically, to phrase well, and his idea was, if you phrase well, you should be able to span the breath. A lot of singers have problem with their breathing, and they run out of breath at the end of a phrase. And actually his idea was if you thought through the phrase, you wouldn't run out of breath. It's not entirely true, but it was a good way of interpreting the repertoire. So sadly he passed away I had several scholarships. So I wasn't a burden to my parents, but I did the opera course for 1 year, and that's when my singing teacher passed away. And so I was without a